Hi. We are about to watch an interview with John Anderson about El Paso County's first sheriff, Rankin Scott Kelly. We even have a first map of Colorado. It's gonna be great. Hope all the history buffs love it. So without further ado, let's go. Okay, so we are here with you again. John Anderson joining us, at the Pines and Plains Library. My name is Becca, and we are going to talk today about your book about the first sheriff of El Paso County. And this is an interesting connection, as you were also a sheriff of El Paso County. So you kind of have a unique perspective and an appreciation for what this man had to go through.
I do, Becca. I really appreciate the chance to be back with you and the patrons there at the library who will be viewing this later. And Sheriff Rankin Scott Kelly is someone who became very dear to me, and I think the biggest reason is because I had the privilege of being elected into the same office he held. I was the 26th sheriff of El Paso County from 1995 until 2003. And Sheriff Kelly was the very first sheriff in El Paso County. He was there from 1861 to 1867. So this is a very special topic and person in my life.
Good. Well, we are excited to hear about it. And I love the fact that you have these slides and you can walk us through,
Mm-hmm.
and it gives us something to kind of track along. And we do have this book in our library, so if people want to check it out. But it is also, is this on Amazon, or is this that they need to email you?
Let's see. You actually have both of my books that we're going to be talking about today. The Nonfiction, which is the historical account of the life and times of Sheriff Rankin Scott Kelly for Sheriff of El Paso County, as you can see on the book cover on the left. But we'll also talk about the historical fiction, which is the book On the Ride, R.S. Kelly, Man of the Territory. And I'll explain how that kind of came about here in a minute. But to answer your question, you have both of these books in your collection. The one on the right is available on Amazon. The one on the left is available only through me at the moment. And I'll give everybody my email address at the end if they want to buy a copy. But we're making a transition where this book will be available on Amazon and print on demand here in a few months.
Okay. Nice. All right. Well, let's hear about Mr. Kelly.
Well, one of the things that for me in law enforcement is in my career, both with the Colorado Springs Police Department, I'm a retired sergeant with the Colorado Springs Police Department, and then at the Sheriff's Office, I've always believed it's important that we honor our past and then in whatever role we were in to help shape the future. And that's something that I carried over after my retirement into the corporate world for 10 years with Lockheed Martin, and now that I retired from Lockheed after 40 years, 30 years law enforcement, 10 years in the corporate world, I was in a position finally to establish a small consulting firm and focus on the writing, the history, and the arts that I have always been passionate about. And this subject, this man, Rankin Scott Kelly, was at the very top of my bucket list. So I've been wanting to write the book on the left since 1995. And what happened when I left the police department and transferred to the sheriff's office, I sat down and in my desk, it had been cleaned out, and except for two old badges that were in one of the desk drawers, but there was no notes and who carried them, and there was no sheriff's badges, just deputy badges. But the desk was really important to me because as I sat there and behind that big, huge wooden desk, this was the same desk that my uncle had sat behind during the 7 years he was the sheriff of El Paso County. He was the 24th sheriff. His name was Rankin Scott, excuse me. His name was Red Davis, and he also was retired from the Colorado Springs Police Department. And I had the privilege of holding the same office he did. And every day I came to work, I sat down at the same desk that he would have sat at. So that was kind of a neat feeling. But I've always wanted to know more about the other sheriffs that preceded my uncle, Sheriff Davis. Excuse me. He was one of my heroes growing up. And I'd known a couple of the sheriffs before him, the elected sheriffs, but the early sheriffs from the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, there was almost nothing written about them. And in fact, a few of them, we didn't even have a photograph of them. We didn't have a photographed example of Sheriff Kelly until 1913, when he was 87 years old. And I would have loved to have come across a photo of him in his 30s when he, served as the sheriff. But we just, that maybe there never was one. We were never able to find one. So what I have been privileged to do in my retirement years, I retired from Lockheed Martin in 2012. So for the last 8 years, I've had the privilege of working on the books that I've wanted to write and go to the places I've wanted to do in researching this and this book and the other books that I've done. In forming this publishing imprint, an imprint of Rhyolite Press, it gives me kind of the freedom to focus on the kinds of books that I wanted. When it came to Rankin Scott Kelley's historical book, I tried to make sure it was historically as accurate, just as much as I could, to include using exact quotes when they were available, firsthand accounts of people who knew him, and also anything that was in print form. So written accounts or an article or a newspaper account. So I tried to be as true as possible to the historical account, but it left me kind of wanting to know more, because we'd find a little snippet of a shootout that he had, and it might record, like, generally where it happened and which gang it was and what happened. Like one of the first shootouts, we think it was him by himself, just Sheriff Kelly, up against 7 cattle rustlers. We think it was near downtown Colorado Springs, where Colorado College soccer field stands today. And but all we knew was that 2 of the outlaws were shot and killed, and a third one wounded. And so it left a lot of gaps in his life story. And not being able to fill those gaps, I wanted to write a historical fiction based upon the historical account. So the one on the right is kind of make-believe, but about 95% of it is accurate. What I love about historical fiction is it makes the characters come alive in the setting and locations. And to me, it's so much more interesting to read than just a set of text. It has date, times, locations, and a lot of our history books are very I don't know what the right word is, stagnant or something, but they don't move, they're not fluid. It's just here, this happened here, here, and here. This is a battle of whatever. Gettysburg's a good example. But when you read authors like Jeff Scherer and Michael Scherer, who took those factual events and people and then establish a first-person dialogue, that you can follow, even though that might not be exactly what they said, you can tell that certainly what happened that day of the battle at Gettysburg and what happened the next day, they certainly would have talked about those kinds of things. So you have to use your imagination a little bit in reading historical fiction based upon nonfiction. But if you are interested in knowing about the early sheriffs of not only El Paso County, but surrounding counties, like where you are in Semla, they would have had the first sheriff probably established about the same time here, and a lot of the same events, especially the hostilities with the Native American tribes that were going on in 1864 to 1869. The sheriffs, in the rest of the counties in Colorado, the other 16, they were dealing with some of the same outlaws and Indian hostilities. So it's very similar to what others would have dealt with as well.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting to know. I bet that, many people could look up those years and kind of get an idea of what was going on in their area.
Excuse me, I have a tickle in my throat. Well, I want to introduce everybody to Sheriff Rankin Scott Kelley on the left. This is my favorite photo of him. Unfortunately, it was taken at the very end of his life in 1913. He was born in 1826, as you can see at the bottom of the photograph. And on the right is Robert Finley, and he was a very influential person and a friend of Sheriff Kelly's. And so the slides kind of capture historically their lives and what they do together. So I just wanted to start with that photo. Sheriff Kelly is coming. I was able to find the exact location based upon this railing in the background in the building. This is today the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum in downtown Colorado Springs. At the time, he would have been coming out of that. This is the west entrance. In 1913, a photographer would have been standing on the steps just below and caught him as he was walking out of there. I found it fascinating and would love to know what that little piece of paper was sticking out of his pocket. So he must have been doing something, changing his voter registration or something. But the sheriff's office would have been in that building too in 1913. So it's kind of neat to go back and stand on the steps or, at the same place as these people in history. And it gives you a sense of what did they see? I don't know how many times I went to the top of that step and walked down and touched that railing and looked around at what he would have seen at the same time that he was 150 years earlier. I wanted to kind of give kind of a bullet points of the highlights of the storyline of Sheriff Kelly's life and kind of show how that parallels with Robert Finley. Sheriff Kelly was born in 1826 in what today is Houlton, Maine. At the time, it was in Canada, and that becomes a disputed part of the boundaries of the U.S. and Canada in the northern tip of what's today Maine. At age 14, he was involved in a fist fight with his sister's fiance. His sister and her fiance, named Emmett, and another girl, were out on a pond near Houlton, and for some reason, I'm sure he was showing off, Emmett caused the little rowboat to tip over, and Kelly was just furious. He's standing on the bank with another boy, and he watches this mishap, and he's becomes enraged when he sees Emmett swimming to shore, leaving the two girls, his sister and the other girl, clinging onto this overturned rowboat. And even though they could both swim, he really just thought that was the wrong thing to do, to not, go back and rescue them. And
Right.
One of the things that I think the reasons he was so emotional is his mother had drowned to death when he was 2. So he was raised by a single father, an older brother, and his sister Catherine, who was out in the lake. So when Emmett wades the shore, even though Emmett was much bigger and older than Kelly was at 14, Kelly punched him and got in a fist fight and must have gotten the best of him, knocked him down. There must have been blood or whatever, because Emmett wasn't moving. And a witness ran over, looked at Emmett, saw the blood or whatever coming down his face, and declared he was dead. And so Kelly backed away, thinking he had just killed his sister's fiance, and ran away. He spent 3 days, he later tells, sleeping in caves and just kind of wandering around. He just knew the hangman was waiting for him, even though the Emmett, recovered and was just fine. But he didn't know that. And so he ran away at 14 years of age. If you can imagine this, a 14-year-old running away from home and never goes back home, never sees his sister, never sees his father or his brother again. When he's 19, he volunteers to fight in the Mexican-American War. So at the very first part of 1846, the war, and he served into 1847. So they saw combat in Mexico, Battle of Veracruz, and just some really bloody battles during the Mexican-American War, which he survives. But obviously, I think it really shaped him, and I think it hardened him as a combat veteran. And probably this is where he learned his skills in firearms and fighting and tactics, because he would have been well trained and then experienced combat. His profession was as a carpenter and a stone mason. And in one of the U.S. Census, he reports that his main profession was a teamster. So he drove the ox wagons, delivered freight. And he built the first brick kiln in El Paso County. So he was there and served on a 3-man jury during the first gunfight in Colorado City, which is the west side of, it's been annexed into Colorado City now, but those of you that are familiar with the old west side of Colorado Springs, well, Michael Garman and kind of, you know, some of the older buildings are, excuse me, in western El Paso County before we get to Manitou Springs. So he witnesses he serves on the jury of the first gunfight in El Paso County, Colorado City. And they acquitted Laughlin, who shot Devlin, even though acquitted him of murder, even though Devlin lived for 2 more weeks. So they knew he was going to die. And so that gunfight took place. And we think it was the first one, and we think Devlin was probably the first man buried in what becomes Boot Hill, north of Colorado City. It doesn't exist anymore. So Kelly is in Finley, arrive the same time on the same wagon train on the Santa Fe Trail in June of 1860. And then the next year, the Colorado Territory is established, February 28th, 1861. And so they had this would happen where you're at too. All across Colorado, the commissioners had to come together and appoint a clerk and recorder, a treasurer, a sheriff, a county commissioners, usually 3. And then they had to run for office the next year once they were organized. So Kelly and Finley were appointed the first sheriff and the first treasurer of El Paso County, Colorado Territory. Then months later in 1862, they had to run for election. So the first elections in Colorado happened in 1862, but most counties like El Paso, they just ran what they call a white ballot. Anybody on there didn't have any opposition, so there was just more formality being elected. During his time in office from 1861 to 1867, he survived 4 shootouts with outlaws. And after the Indian Wars in about 1869 or 1870, he sold his land. He had a lot of land, so he sold the most prized piece to General Palmer, who was the founder of Colorado Springs, which was founded in 1871. And some of you may be familiar with the site. It's north of the Garden of the Gods, and today it's known as Glen Erie Castle, and it's owned
That was his?
The land was his. Now,
oh, awesome.
Actually put any improvements on the land. He might have had a corral or, you know, small building, and none of that survives. But Palmer fell in love with the land, the canyon that he called Queens Canyon. And I found a newspaper article in 1913 that said General Palmer paid Rankin Scott Kelley $1,000 for the land. So in the 1860s, 1870s, $1,000 cash is a lot of money. So Kelley ended up literally riding off into the sunset to the west with $1,000 in his pocket, probably more, since, you know, he had sold some other land. And he went all the way to California, got to see the ocean, and he established a ranch in the San Joaquin Mountains. But then he ended up coming back to Colorado, lived in Uray, and I'll spend a little more time in some of the details here. But he dies at the Myron Stratton home in 1913, on December 30th, 1913. And I'll kind of explain that. Finley, on the other hand, is about 4 years younger. You can see he was born in Lafayette, and his profession was a surveyor and a sawmill owner. And he was paid by the county commissioners in Johnson County to help establish the town of Olaf. So he was a surveyor, owned a sawmill, and had helped laid out the town of Olaf. So he was the exact person with the right skills and the equipment to come in response to the Pikes Peak Gold Rush from 1860.
Sorry.
It's okay. Pikes Peak gold in the Pikes Peak region was found in 1858. 1859 begins the gold rush, and it goes to about the time that Colorado becomes a territory, 1861. So now we have this influx of almost 100,000 people over that 3-year period who flow into what's today the state of Colorado. But many of them are miners and prospectors. But what a lot of people realized from the California gold rush 10 years earlier is that there was more money to be made mining the miners than mining for the gold itself. So we have people coming in with the infrastructure to build the businesses to provide the food and the tools for the prospectors and the miners. And one of the first things you're going to need is lumber, cut lumber, because everything else was just logs. So what Finley brought was the components of a 12 horsepower sawmill, a steam-driven sawmill that he disassembled with Sheriff Kelly and some other business associates in Johnson County, which is the extreme eastern part of what's today the state of Kansas. So they take the sawmill apart and they load it into wagons, and they join a wagon train headed west on the Santa Fe Trail, and I'll show a map here in a minute, with the components of the very first sawmill in all of the Pikes Peak region in the back. So he's elected the first treasurer of El Paso County. I love this. He collects one year this $138 in taxes. That was what the whole county generated, what they had to live off of. And it's fun to go back and see some of the transactions where they're reimbursing Kelly for, some ammunition. And it's really kind of neat to think about how, budgets back then compared to today. Robert Finley is a sergeant in the 3rd Colorado Territory Cavalry, 3rd Colorado Cavalry, and did see action at Battletown, Sand Creek, so we'll talk about that. And then afterwards, he becomes the elected county assessor of El Paso County, becomes very active in the Sonic Lodge and an officer, and ends up marrying Allie, who is his wife, and they have one daughter. And then towards the end of his life, in 1930, he dies in 1913, but in 1912, he builds a beautiful 2-story home at 3022 West Bijou Street, kind of on the west side of Colorado Springs. It's not there anymore. They tore it down some time back and built apartments. But he built that for Allie, his wife, the year before he died. So it's a fascinating parallel. Kelly never marries, and he was single his whole life and dies within months of when Robert Finley passed away. Before I go on to the Santa Fe Trail, do you have any questions there? I saw you take notes.
Is that Myron Stratton home still around?
It is, and I'd love to go back there, and it's fun to walk the grounds in some of the original cottages. I don't know which one he was in.
Where is it?
I'm
not familiar.
If you're in downtown Colorado Springs and you're going south, like towards Fort Carson, the main gate of Fort Carson, so if you're following Nevada Avenue through the main part of Colorado Springs and going south, it becomes Highway 115. And as you're going up the hill, it's probably, 2 miles, 3 miles south of downtown Colorado Springs. As you're going up the hill, we're at the high point. On the left is the Myron Stratton home. And that was built by Winfield Scott Stratton, who was one of the men who struck it rich in Cripple Creek in the gold days. And he named it after his father, Myron Stratton. And so when he died, when Winfield Scott Stratton died, he was single, no children. He left his wealth from the gold mines to this philanthropic organization that still exists today. And what he wanted it for was for poor, indigent people, particularly the elderly and the young. And one of the conditions was they don't pay any room and board or for meals. And so he set enough of his wealth aside, and it's been managed since 1913 for over 130 years so well that today they still do scholarships and feed the elderly and the poor out of the Myron Stratton home. And Kelly was the 4th person who was admitted to the home, but I'd get a little ahead of myself. But he was so proud he wouldn't accept charity. And so they offered him a nominal job as the night watchman, and he took it. And so he was so diligent about his jobs that he'd do his night watchman duty at night. And he was only there from about Thanksgiving of 1913, the 4th person to move in. But the first week of December 1913 is a huge snowstorm blizzard, which would have affected almost all of eastern Colorado, central and southern Colorado, and the snow's up to their waist. Anyway, he is out making his rounds, and he catches a cold, which leads to pneumonia, and then he dies the December 30th of 1930 at the Myron Stratton home. But it's kind of neat to walk the grounds and know that's the grounds that he would have walked. And there's a little footbridge, and you can tell that was the footbridge. He would have gone over a stone footbridge, and so it was kind of neat to be able to know where the end of his life happened, where he died. And I visited his gravesite many times. We'll end with that in Evergreen Cemetery near where Robert Finley is buried. So it's kind of gone full circle with their lives.
Nice.
I probably got off on a tangent there, but I think
no, I like tangents. We don't want to make this too long of a video, but I think those side trips are just kind of interesting, because I'm going to guess that most people, once we get them interested with these little side trips, they're probably going to come check out your book.
I think so too, and they'll also see so many parallels with other people who took these same kind of trips that are early pioneers, who settled the Colorado Territory that becomes the state of Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good segue for this slide here. On the left, you see a map of the Santa Fe Trail. Now, there were two primary routes. The one most traveled when you left Independence, Missouri, they launched at Westport, and then you'd follow the Santa Fe Trail. At about Council Grove, you had to make a decision. You could either take the north branch that went up and followed the South Platte River, or actually I said that wrong. The fork was here at Westport, so you'd follow the Missouri River, and then at the branch of the Platte River, you'd follow it west until you hit the branch for the South Platte, and that led you to where Denver is today, where Cherry Creek intersects at that confluence. And that was probably traveled by, I don't know, a huge percentage, partly because when you took the Santa Fe Trail, depending on what time, but it was much more hazardous, more Indian raids and things like that when you're traveling the Santa Fe Trail, which depends on where you're going. If you were going to the Pikes Peak region where Colorado City is today, this is a more direct route, the Santa Fe Trail. And so at Council Grove, they're traveling, taking the left fork on the Santa Fe Trail. And then there's another fork you'll see here. This is the Cimarron route, which goes to the south, and then the mountain branch. The Cimarron route traveled over land claimed by the Kiowa, the Comanche, and it was a very dangerous route and very hazardous because you didn't know what the water was going to be like, like at the Cimarron River. And then they came back together again. You can see where the mountain branch and the Cimarron branch come back together southeast of Taos before they get to Santa Fe, so they reconverge. And where they come back together right at that fork is where Fort Union was built. But the one fort along the Santa Fe Trail was, it's been rebuilt today, is Bent's Old Fort. And if you're a history lover like me and you've not been to Bent's Old Fort, definitely put that on your bucket list. It's run by the National Park Service. They've rebuilt it, reestablished it. There's reenactors there. And this is what the fort looked like. So a major trading post. Matter of fact, from Westport all the way to the Pacific Ocean. If you were traveling the Santa Fe Trail, other than dropping all the way down into Santa Fe, which was Mexico at the time, up until 1848, this was like the only place to stop to, trade in your horses or your oxen or make repairs to your wagons or get provisions. And Bent's Old Fort is a wonderful part of our history that's been preserved. Now, truth in lending, that when Kelly went through, Bent's Old Fort was no longer operational except for a stage stop because Bent had built Bent's new fort, which was further east. And that's where Fort Lyons is established, and then the town of Fort Lyons, Lyons, Colorado is today. And that's closer to where the Sand Creek Massacre was. When you go to and this was kind of a neat experience that I got to do too, in tracing the route that Sheriff Kelly and Robert Finley would have come, in some places you can actually find the wagon ruts of the original Santa Fe Trail. And one of the best preserved wagon ruts is on the national parkland at Vince Old Fort. So when you're there at the fort, if you ever get to go, you definitely go into the fort, go around. You can even climb up above on the ramparts and look at the views and touch the cannon and those kind of things. But when you come out of the main gate, if you turn right to go walk south, you can walk right to the bank of the Arkansas River, which is where they would have watered the horses and the oxen and got water for themselves. And I'm standing on the wagon ruts when I take this picture looking west. So it depends on when you would have been traveling the Santa Fe Trail. If you were there in 1846, 1847, when you looked across the river to the left, to the south, that bank right there, that was Mexico. And a lot of people don't realize Mexico extended all the way north to what's today the Arkansas River. So towns like Pueblo or Canyon City, if you were on the south side of the river, you were in Mexico. If you were on the north side, you were in the United States. And so we're standing there at the international boundary of two countries at that spot that's preserved today. And in 1846, 1847, these two countries were at war with one another, and that's when Kelly was served. So if you continued west from Vince Old Fort, the trail that connected the Santa Fe Trail that ran along the Arkansas to the California-Oregon Trail, which ran along the Platte River and then went west where Fort Bridger is, you have the Cherokee Trail. And the Cherokee Trail connected the Santa Fe Trail, where connected Vince Old Fort, and connected Fort Bridger in Wyoming. And it ran right through north, through Pueblo County, El Paso County, Douglas County, all the way north. It followed a tributary of the Cherry Creek to where the Cherry Creek Mall is today. And then it went further north all the way to Wyoming. So that connection there, the Cherokee Trail, is a fascinating part of our history that very little is documented about. But part of the challenge was we go through an evolution where you were at in Simla. People don't realize this. That was part of the Spanish Empire, during the Napoleonic Wars. Spain loses the war and cedes that part of the Spanish territory to France, and the dictator Napoleon Bonaparte is actually the dictator over that part of what becomes New France, and Napoleon is who sells the land that includes Louisiana Purchase to the United States. So everybody that's educated in public schools across Colorado, the United States, we've all heard of the Louisiana Purchase. What a lot of people don't realize is the land in much of what was the Colorado Territory, before that the Kansas Territory, was part of the French Empire, and before that part of the Spanish Empire. But if you live south of the Arkansas, you're actually in Mexico at different times. So we have three different countries, three different languages, and different time frames, and so the early history is hard to hang on to. So we go from being part of the Kansas-Nebraska territory. So when Kelly is traveling west to 1860, it's still part of the Kansas territory. And you can see on this map, the black lines are the modern states today. So the Colorado Territory gets carved out of 4 existing territories: Nebraska, Utah, New Mexico, and the Kansas Territory. And that's when the towns begin to be established and infrastructures kind of start coming into play. This is the Fosdick Plat. So this is the original map, the plat for Colorado City, where that was the main town in El Paso County where Sheriff Kelly, he ended up owning several lots, and he was building some homes. So this is where the county administration was. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner an old map that showed the Santa Fe Trail and the northern route, they called part of this the Denver Road. So depending on where you were coming from or going to, if you're headed to Denver further north, you'd want to take the northern route to the south here. So the one of the neat things about this old map, it's 1859. So the gold rush again started 1858. This map's drawn 1859, and it's El Paso County initials JT, which stood for the Jefferson Territory. So before we were established as the Colorado Territory, there was an attempt to establish the Jefferson Territory. And because the Civil War and Secretary Jefferson Davis, that name was very unpopular at the time, but Colorado could just almost as easily been known as the state of Jefferson as it was Colorado, which is kind of fun to think about. Robert Finley filed the original land patent for Colorado City, which gave legal title to these areas, these lots in the city. So that's kind of fun. Finley ended up selling his mill, his sawmill that was located in eastern El Paso County, near what was called the Pineries, which are part of Black Forest. He sells his sawmill to Jerome A. Weir, and it becomes well known as the Weir Mill, and it's 12 miles northeast of today's Colorado Springs. This is kind of a neat old lithograph of the original mill, and so Kelly and Finley ended up building several houses on lots in Colorado City. The oldest standing surviving building in today's Colorado Springs was a stone building built by Rankin Scott Kelley. So it's kind of neat to know that. And he delivered the first load of cut lumber to Colorado City. This is a fascinating.
Well, pardon me, what building is that today? That stone building?
It's at the northeast corner of Colorado Avenue and 28th Street. And it's changed hands many times. I'm not sure who owns it today. But when you park on 28th Street, just off Colorado, you can touch the original stone building, the wall that he built. And that's the exact same spot where the McLaughlin-Devlin gunfight happened. That was the main interest in the Colorado City. So a lot of history as you walk down that little narrow street that most people don't even know about.
Okay.
Let me share this map. This is a fascinating map for those patrons who are interested. You'll want to study this and zoom it in and see where you're located and things. And the next map is the same thing. I just love old maps, and they're really fun to study, and they really give you a different perspective of our history and how it evolved, our early history in the Colorado Territory. This is probably the very first map ever drawn of the Colorado Territory. Again, we were established February 28, 1861, and authorized by Act of Congress and signed by President Buchanan. And then this map is made in 1861. So from end of February until the end of 1861, this first map of the Colorado Territory is established. What's kind of fascinating is we don't even have counties in here yet. But look, we do have an Indian reservation for the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, and it went all the way east. The El Paso County line is the western boundary, but it ends up going all the way to the Kansas state line and ran north of the Arkansas River. You can find where Bent's Old Fort is, Big Timbers is down here. So you have the sandy fork of this creek, but look just north of there, this is the Smoky Hill Fork. And that's important too. And you all are found similar, depending on where you live, probably just north of the Smoky Hill River Creek Fork in the Republican River. Do you know the Republican River just north of you? In Elizabeth and Simla. So you can find these existing places, today on maps. This is the south fork of the Platte Rivers, and where downtown Denver is. Pikes Peak is here. So we're seeing these squares, which are survey townships, and they're just starting to take place. So how they do this is they establish a baseline as the West is being established. So a baseline is created first, and then from that they measure these townships, identify them, mark them, survey them, and you'll see in the next map that that it's even evolved beyond that. So the only townships we really have are in the Denver area today, Colorado City area, and right down here along the Rio Grande in the San Luis Valley. There's a few townships that are starting to take place. I should ask, Becca, did you have any questions on that before I jump into this Colorado
Nope.
map?
I'm getting good at interrupting you.
Please do. I'm trying to keep respectful of people's times here too, but this is such a fascinating part of our history. And the Colorado Territory, again, established 1861. This map's drawn in 1866. So what happens between those two dates, 1861 and 1865, is the American Civil War. So as soon as the Civil War is over, within months, the USGS, Geologic Survey, is out in the Colorado Territory, I'm sure all the territories, and they're mapping this area. And so the original Douglas County, what county is Simla in?
We're kind of El Paso and Elbert, because Elbert kind of swings down and makes that little leg.
Yeah.
So we're kind of right there.
Yeah. So you can see the Republic River, Smoky Hill River, where this would be a landmark for you. The Kansas Pacific Railroad that ran along the Smoky Hill Creek Fork and then ran straight to Denver. That ran over the Indian Reserve for the Cheyenne and Arapaho, and that becomes really critical here in a few moments. But you can see El Paso County incorporate all of what's Teller County to the west, where Pikes Peak is. It gets divided up. Pueblo County exists. Orfano County still exists, but I think there's like 4 or 5 counties now. That was a big county. Weld County, obviously just north of you. But these counties went all the way from the Front Range all the way to what's today the Kansas state line. So there were some big counties, like Summit County is huge, and Lake County is here, Conejos County. So out of the 64 counties we have today in the state of Colorado, they can all trace their origin back to the original 17 counties. And again, each of those counties would have needed to establish the infrastructure to support the people in that county, whether that's the sheriff, the treasurer, clerk and recorder, the county commissioners. So in 1866, we still have shown on this map the Indian Reserve for the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. This yellow kind of or goldish colored kind of looks like a stain. Maybe it is, but if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the legend for this, and this is identifying the mineral belt for the Colorado Territory. So it's identifying in this map, drawn in 1866, where to find the resources for gold and silver and even coal, to run your mines and your sawmills and so on. So we're starting to see, Colorado Springs doesn't exist yet, but we're starting to see the evolution of the infrastructure for the state of Colorado. El Paso County, where I was the sheriff, and Sheriff Kelly was the first sheriff, it was named for the Spanish name of the pass, and the Ute Pass, very well known historic trail for the Native Americans use. This photograph was taken in 1913, the year that Sheriff Kelly died, in the Garden of the Gods. And the Ute return. You see all the Ute chiefs here with their headdresses, and they're along this trail, which is now a paved road that goes through the Garden of the Gods. This is kind of a neat old photograph. It shows the wagon train going up the Ute Pass from what's today Manitou Springs, Colorado Springs, as you're going up to what we know as Woodland Park today. But you can see how treacherous this was, and it's kind of neat to look at these old supports, these trees that they tried to block up there with a railing. But the wagon trains, these are going uphill to go the Gold Hills north and west of Pikes Peak, where Cripple Creek stands today, and in that area. But the traffic became so treacherous and so heavy in the 1860s that they had to make one-way traffic. So in the morning, all the traffic was going uphill, and from noon to the end of the day, all the traffic was going downhill. So the road had to become a one-way road. It was so much traffic. I went to the document fairly well uh, uh, 4 shootouts, 3 of them with outlaw gangs. The Salt Lake City Gem Gang was the first shootout that I'd mentioned earlier with cattle rustlers, where 2 men were killed, 1 was wounded. Again, in the historical fiction, I kind of fill in the gaps and kind of go through the gunfight, who shot when and where, and kind of have fun with that. And I think the readers will enjoy that. The Hungate gang is one of the places where Sheriff Kelly has his horse shot out from under him. That happens to him twice. The Big Tooth Gem gang, and this is one we probably know the most details about, because he's interviewed in 1913, the year he dies, by a newspaper reporter, Dora Foster, who did a good job interviewing him and then published not only a newspaper account of the interview after he passed away, but also later, and I think like 1950, she published a small pamphlet of that interview and some other remembrance. This is a fun detail. And again, the exact historical account is in the nonfiction, and in the fiction, it kind of fills in the gaps of the arrest of James Clark, who was an employee of the U.S. Mint in Denver, and he embezzled over $36,000 in cash and gold from the safe there, and took off. And Sheriff Kelly was helped and chased him down, arrested him on Fountain Creek, and brought him back to Denver and turned him over to authorities there. And James Clark ended up escaping from jail in Denver twice. The first time he's found in LaPorte and arrested by a marshal and brought back to the city jail, and he escapes again. So and he's never found after that. So there's always been some questions. Did he have help? Because they recover most of the money, but maybe not all of it. Sheriff Kelly, there was a reward offered of $1,000. In the interview, Kelly in 1913, Kelly says he was paid $2,000. So we think he might have been collected the $1,000 reward on the arrest of Clark, and may have been given an additional $1,000 because he recovered probably 90% of the money and turned it over. And I always thought that was a real testament to the honesty and integrity of El Paso County's first lawman, that he had this money, huge wealth, that was in his possession, but he turned every penny of that over to the authorities at the Denver Mint. So when he's interviewed, he talks about the 2 horses that are shot out from under him, and then hostilities with the Indians. And in one encounter, an arrow goes through his boot, pierces his boot, and at the same time, his reins on his horse were shredded. So he was really in the thick of things during the Indian battles and the hostilities, and just very fortunate he was never wounded, but he was around other people who were killed. In fact, in one of the shootouts with the Hungate gang, the man riding the horse just to his right was shot and killed. Kelly's stirrup is shot off on the saddle, and the heel on his right boot is shot off, and his horse is shot. So he's right in the thick of it, but he's not wounded. Sheriff Kelly served his first 4 years from, again, 1861 when he appointed. 1862 he's the elected sheriff. It's 4-year terms, so till 1866. And so he doesn't run for re-election, and a mercantile by the name of Bert Myers decides he's going to be the second sheriff. So he runs and is elected. But on his 3rd day in office, the Big Tooth Gem Gang rode into town, and Sheriff Myers tries to arrest these 3 outlaws, and they steal his horse and his new Colt revolver. And Sheriff Myers walked back into Colorado City and threw his badge on the desk and quit. And somebody went and got Kelly, who was building houses now, and so he picks up the badge and he chases down the Big Tooth Gem Gang with one deputy, chase them down into northern New Mexico, and they ambush the outlaws at morning as they're fixing breakfast. So that account is pretty well detailed in Sheriff Kelly's words with Dora Foster. I was going to jump into the Indian Wars, but do you have any questions up to that point, Vic?
No, I'm loving. I love stories of just old-fashioned, strong male role models, and I'm just kind of, you may see me chuckling because I'm just going, yeah. I mean, a job needed to be done. The other guy didn't want to do it, so all right, I'll keep doing it.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the things I did was a couple of things I did with Rocky Mountain PBS. Most people are familiar with that. They have a
Hmm.
segment called Colorado Experience, and every year they do a viewer's choice. So, throughout the year they produce what they want you to see, but then they also have this competition where every year they ask if you viewers have somebody. And so, like the Ludlow Massacre was one. And so I put Sheriff Rankin Scott Kelly in to be the subject. And he didn't win that year, but he took second. And at the end of the year, after they produced whatever, I think it was something on women minors, they did the Viewer's Choice Award. But the executive director, Julie Spear with Rocky Mountain PBS, she called and she says, "Hey, John," she said, "we were so impressed with your submission, although you didn't win, you took second." And Sheriff Kelly had like 111 votes, and so there was a lot of interest in this sheriff. And she said, "We have just a little bit of budget left. We think we can produce a second documentary, 30-minute documentary, if you'll help us, if you'll let us use your research." I said, "Oh, I'd love to, because I want to keep this." So we did a 30-minute documentary that you can look up and watch on Sheriff Kelly. It's really well done. Just hit
Awesome.
Google Rocky Mountain PBS Colorado Experience as the Sheriff, and you'll be entertained with that. But here's the second thing we did with another writer friend of mine who had written 3 screenplays. We wrote a screenplay for a movie based on Sheriff Kelly's life and time. And we were able to turn that over, and we got a little interest through a literary agent, and she reviewed our script. And what she said, and this gets back to what you just brought up about the strong male roles, she loved the storyline, and she said, "I'm really interested in this, but you need a strong female character, because this is just all about men." And she said, "Women had a role in the American West, and you need to develop a strong female character." So that's the one change from the historical fiction novel. From the historical account, is Gina, my friend who co-authored this screenplay, we took 3 women who actually existed and merged those 3 and created a strong love interest with Sheriff Kelly based upon the request from this literary agent. And I think it really enriched the novel, but we're still trying to sell that movie. So if anybody is watching this who's related to Clint Eastwood or some famous movie producer, let us know, because we'd sure love to see this turned into a movie.
Yeah, yeah, I think that would be totally a good movie. Everybody's in love with the Wild West, and Colorado was very much right there.
We
So,
were. And in fact, the years 1864 to 1869 were, this is what they call the Cheyenne Wars. When you talk and you read the early pioneers, what they say, this wasn't 2 wars, 1864 and 1868 or 1869. This is one continuous war with 2 bumps, in statistics of, death and violence. 1864 and 1868 were particularly violent, and the most violent of the most violent are hostile. And I should really preface this, that not every Native American were hostile to the pioneers. In fact, the Ute and the early pioneer settlers were much more closely aligned, and many friendships developed out of that, like Chief Uray and Kit Carson's a perfect example. And many, almost all of the Native American tribes, like most all the Plains Indians, the Cheyenne Arapaho out where you're at, the Kiowa, before them, the Comanche, they would attack anybody, whether it was, another Indian tribe or settlers of the Spanish or traders. So this was a very violent time where we saw a lot of warring between allies of Native Americans against other Native American tribes, and in many cases against the white settlers. So a very difficult time. And during the Civil War, we might have had forts, but a lot of the officers and some of the soldiers emptied out of those forts, to go fight back east in the Civil War. And so a lot of that responsibility for the hostilities fell back on the local sheriffs. So they were very involved in a lot of the violence that happens. Particularly violent were the dog soldiers. and the dog soldiers were made up predominantly of the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, and they lived. They were an outlaw society of the Indian tribes because they lived outside of the leadership of the traditional Council of the Elders, Council of 44. They were a very violent, accomplished light cavalry. They fought on horseback. A lot of atrocities committed on both sides, I should emphasize. Atrocities committed against the Native American people and reprisals against the settlers. And this had gone on for a number of years, but most particularly during the years of 1864 to 1868. Many people of viewers were probably aware and familiar with the Hungate Massacre, which occurred in Douglas County, June 11th, 1864, on a ranch with Running Creek, Box Elder Creek, north of today's Elizabeth, and Nathan Hungate, along with his wife Ellen and Laura, who was 2.5, and then baby Florence, who was only 6 months. They were brutally killed and attacked. We were fairly certain it was dog soldiers, but almost undeniably Cheyenne warriors. And this leads to the battle. It depends on the point of your view, whether it was a battle at Sand Creek or a massacre at Sand Creek. I think most of the preponderance of the evidence will support that it's a massacre that occurs there. But before the Sand Creek Massacre, the Hungate family, their mutilated bodies were put on public display in Denver, if you can imagine this. So here's a family of 4, and people line up for hours to view their bodies. And this was encouraged by many of the leaders in the communities because there had been many attacks and many white settlers who had been reported as being killed, and then they'd show up in town 3 weeks later, and there was such disinformation and misinformation at the time. A lot of people didn't believe what was reported in the media, and so the bodies were purposely put on display to say, citizens of the Colorado Territory, you need to take this threat seriously. Don't dismiss this. And this also led to such public outrage that on August 11th, 1864, Governor Evans ordered Colonel John Shivington, who was in charge of the 1st Cavalry, the Colorado Cavalry, to raise the 3rd Infantry, a volunteer cavalry, and to not only protect the settlers, but also to punish the Indian tribes who were involved, predominantly the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. And so this poster on the right is the original poster of the recruiting poster to get what was called 100-day volunteers. So during the Civil War, you could volunteer for a 3-year enlistment, but it was hard to get people to volunteer for 3 years because they had farms or ranches to run. But and so this begins in August 13th, 1864, when they start the recruitment of these 100-day volunteers. So they sign up only for 100 days, and that 100 days was rapidly running out. And I think Shivington had the military force, but he didn't know where to find the Indians to confront them, particularly the dog soldiers. But he did know where the Cheyenne Arapaho were encamped on Sand Creek, and that leads to the attack at Sand Creek, which is undeniably a massacre. Robert Finley is a sergeant who is assigned to Company G of the 3rd Regimental Volunteers, along with another sergeant whose name was John Brown. And then their corporal, who did a lot of the administrative things, was Irving Halbert. And that name becomes very famous, and it's one of the primary sources of the Battle of Sand Creek is Irving Halbert. So this is an artist rendering of the attack at Black Kettle's camp village and Chief White Antelope with the Arapaho. That was in the November 1864. That results in in January 1865 with an attack with over 1,000 dog soldiers, Cheyenne Arapaho warriors, attacking and destroying the town of Julesburg. and there's 2 attacks, soldiers as well as civilians killed at the first attack, and the Indians came back, I think it was 4 days later, and the second time all the soldiers and civilians were forded up, but they watched as the Indians rode into town and completely burnt the town of Julesburg to the ground, and then they rode away, and that was in retaliation to Sand Creek. And then things kind of subsided a little bit from 1866, 67, and then peaked again in 1868. Very bloody year. And one of the ones that happens near where you were at in Simla was on August 27th, 1868, with Henrietta Dietemann and her 5-year-old son, whose name was John, who were killed on Cherokee Creek. Do you know where Cherokee Creek is in your area?
Mm-mm.
I think it's just east of Elizabeth, but there's some firsthand accounts who saw 30 hostile Indians making that attack. And again, their bodies were placed on public display in Denver too, which leads to again an outcry from the public that we've got to do something. But there were many other. I think there were 35 just in the Douglas, Arapahoe, northern El Paso County area that were killed during that time. So now Kelly left office 1867, but he helped 1868, 1869 to hunt down the hostile Indians. So we get some firsthand accounts of how that happened with him. This stone monument with this bronze plaque stands in Boulder Crescent Park, which is downtown Colorado Springs at the intersection of Platte and Cascade on the northwest corner. And it has the names of some of what they, in 1868, of the victims who were killed, including Charlie Everhart, who was 17, and then 2 brothers, George and Franklin Robbins, George was 11, Frank was 8, and they were tending cattle, range cattle, along Fountain Creek in the area near just north of downtown Colorado Springs, Colorado College. So very bloody time. After the Cheyenne Wars, the Cheyenne Arapahoe are forced into Indian country, which we know today is the state of Oklahoma. Then Kelly, 1869, 1870, sells his land to General Palmer, rides off to the West Coast, but we know he returns for the silver boom in Leadville. And this is a beautiful lithograph of the silver boom and the influx of people into Leadville area. And I found when I was up there, they have a wonderful mining museum if you like mining history. But I was able to find a line through a librarian, by the way, Becca, who was very diligent in helping me search their archives. And she found this claim for the Rankin mine, but the name was spelled R.S. Kelly with an E-Y. And she said, I think it must be him because it's the Rankin mine, but the name's misspelled. And I said, I found that many times, it'd be spelled with K-E-L-L-Y and sometimes an E-Y. And sometimes they go by Rankin, sometimes they go by R. Scott Kelly or just Scott Kelly. And I always wondered if that was his attempt, to kind of, not be found by the law, because he's thinking again all this time he's wanted for killing Emmett. And so when this Colorado Springs Gazette newspaper found the actual newspaper in the archives at the Pikes Peak Library and their special collections. And this is one of my favorite photos. This was a photo of the Myron Stratton home we were talking about earlier, Colorado Springs, right after it was founded by a lonely millionaire to provide institution where orphans and the aged poor could be housed. And Kelly, they didn't have Social Security or pensions back then, and he did not do well in the silver mine, probably lost his shirt. And so he, in poor health at 1913, at age 87, returns to Colorado Springs and becomes a resident there in the night watchman. And just weeks later is when the blizzard of December 1913 happens. And Kelly, making his rounds at night, gets soaked in the snow, comes back in this cold that leads to pneumonia. He's bedridden and he passes away on December 30th, 1913. I returned to his gravesite to plant some flowers 100 years later, the 100-year anniversary to the day. with my dog Mango. This is our black lab. I kind of did a hiccup there because Mango's no longer with us. But it was really, so we have Puck, who's my new dog. So new dog is 5 years old. He's sleeping in the chair next to me. But
Mm-hmm.
Mango was really a sweetheart. And when I let her out of the car this day, December 30th, 2013, 100 years later, she, like most dogs, kind of run around and sniffs the bushes. But then she came over as I put the flowers there and sniffed the gravesite, laid down, and just stared at his grave. It was really a moving moment it was just her and me, in this graveyard. But one of the last things that Kelly said to Dora Foster during the interview in 1913, just a few months before he died, was she says, oh, I missed this one important part. So 1913, he's back in Colorado Springs, staying at the Meyer and Stratton home. He's waiting on a park bench, go back to the home, and an elderly couple sits down next to him, and they start talking, and it turns out they're from Holton, Maine. And he's, thinking, well, I've never met anybody from Holton. And as they're talking, they find out that they know his sister and they know Emmett. And Emmett's like a retired pharmacist or something like that. And so Emmett's very much alive. So he realizes that I didn't have to run away after all. I wasn't wanted by the law all this time. And so Doris says, well, what's that like to find out that the man you thought you killed was still alive? And he said, I'm glad to know that before I go over yonder, my hands are clean. And within probably 60 days of making that statement, he does go over yonder. And the El Paso County Pioneers Association got him a nice casket and paid for the modest tombstone. On the left, about, I don't know, maybe 150 yards away, is a really nice ornate granite grave marker for the Finley family. And this says father here for Robert Finley, who had just passed away within months before Kelly. And this was Robert's wife, Allie, and this was their daughter, Grace. And I think she was only 18 or 19 when she passed away. But I kind of wanted to end the talk kind of showing kind of the end of life, and that it's kind of neat to know they started on the Santa Fe Trail together in 1860, and they're so close together still for eternity. When they died in 1913, one of the people with the Old Colorado City Historical Society who did some tremendous research on my behalf for Sheriff Kelly. I don't think it was for me as much as it was to honor the life and time of Sheriff Kelly, was Tom Daniels, the archivist. And what I always remembered this quote and respected. Tom spent hours and hours researching Sheriff Kelly for me. And I said, well, why was this so important? And since Sheriff Kelly and Robert Finley were our first sheriff and treasurer of our county, one of the things that Tom said at the bottom was, the first of anything ought to be remembered. So I think all the first sheriffs and all of the 16 other counties in Colorado Territory ought to be remembered too. At his gravesite in 1913, when they're having his funeral services, a man who knew him and Dora Foster talked to that man, but did not record his name, or at least the name didn't survive. But what he said does survive. And she asked him, how should Sheriff Kelly be remembered? And this man knew Kelly and was here during the shootouts and the Indian Wars. And what he said, this great quote that I wanted to end with, said that Sheriff Kelly was straight and strong and true. And what an attribute for one of the first lawmen in the Colorado Territory. And I just also want to put up my contact information, my email address, and if anybody's interested in a book, again, they're in the collection at the Pines and Plains Library in Simla and Elizabeth, all your branches. But it's been a privilege for me to be back with you, Becca, and share this story of Sheriff Kelly with all of your viewers.
Well, I'm just thrilled to have this interview with you. I think this was one of the first ones when I saw you, and we talked about the prayer trees first, because of course we did that in person again in February up in Elizabeth. But you gave me the list of all your books, and And I love historical fiction because it can draw you in. And I think you learn from your history. And that comes back to what you want to do. You want to honor your past, inspire the future. That's what history does. And I really like these books. I'm excited to hopefully get some other people reading them and get them turned on to your website. And this is great. I'm just glad to be able to visit with you again. And we'll have to do another one. I'm gonna have, like, I guess, a whole John series on my YouTube channel. But you're interesting to talk to, and I like that you're willing to teach us. So
No,
that's awesome. Thank you.
my pleasure. Thank you. Hope everybody enjoyed it.